The cockpit was a screaming mosaic of mismatched holographic interfaces and exposed wiring that smelled faintly of scorched insulation and copper. Silas Thorne didn't look at the gauges. He felt the ship through the soles of his boots. The deck plates bucked like a live thing as the Vexor swarm closed in, their geometric perfection a terrifying contrast to the jagged, rust-streaked hull of the Spearhead. Beside him, Alara Vance slammed a physical override lever into place, her knuckles white against the grime. This was the moment the galaxy had deemed impossible, a salvaged wreck of Xylari grace, gutted and stuffed with Terran audacity, charging headlong into a hive mind that didn't know how to calculate for luck. It turned out that one species' interstellar trash was humanity's ticket to the stars. The crimson wastes of Terra Nova had been a graveyard for months before Alara and Silas found the prototype. It sat half-buried in the iron-rich dust, a silver needle of Xylari engineering that had simply stopped. The Xylari Concord built things to be universal, designed to interface with every known sentient biology in the sector. But the universe is messy. The compatibility matrix had collapsed under the weight of its own complexity, leaving a billion-credit miracle of science to rot in the sand because it couldn't decide which neural pathway to prioritize. Alara had stood in the shadow of the derelict, wiping sweat from her brow, looking up at the smooth alien curves with a scavenger's hunger. The Xylari expected us to worship their broken god machine. Instead, we stripped it for parts. Truth is, the Xylari didn't understand the concept of a sledgehammer. They spent decades trying to make a key that fit every lock. Humanity just wanted a door that opened when they kicked it. Within 48 hours, the salvage camp was a hive of controlled chaos. Silas had been neck-deep in the cooling vents of the quantum drive, his face smeared with hydraulic fluid that stained like ink. He didn't care about the universal interface. He didn't care about the elegant, multi-species logic gates. He looked at the shimmering core and saw raw power being choked by its own politeness. "The logic is too broad, Alara," he'd shouted over the whine of a plasma cutter. "It's trying to think for everyone at once. It's paralyzed, so stop making it think," she replied, leaning over the console with a soldering iron clamped between her teeth. "Rewire the neural relays. If it can't talk to everyone, make it talk only to us. Force the frequency. Give it a human-centric heartbeat." They worked in the cramped belly of the ship, the air thick with the heat of exertion and the sharp tang of ozone. There was no room for the rigid perfection the Vexor swarm demanded of their vassals. There was only the weight of a wrench in Silas's hand and the focused intensity in Alara's eyes as she bypassed a century of alien philosophy with a handful of jumper cables. They weren't building a masterpiece, they were building a weapon. By the time the first Vexor scouts entered the system, the prototype wasn't a Xylari vessel anymore. It was a Terran chimera, a snarling, cobbled-together beast of salvage and spite, and it was only the beginning. Behind it, a dozen other wrecks were waking up, their engines coughing to life with a rugged, uneven rhythm. The Vexor swarm didn't believe in mistakes. Their formation was a perfect crystal of logic, a geometric nightmare that had wiped out 3 civilizations by simply being more efficient. But as the first wave of their interceptors locked onto the human fleet, their processors stuttered. They were looking for high-grade Xylari signatures, for the elegant curves of universal tech. Instead, they found a wall of screaming metal and duct-taped fury. Perfection was losing the war, so humanity brought a fleet of junk to save the galaxy. Silas gripped the flight stick, a modified piece of industrial rebar welded to a Xylari sensor array, and felt the kickback of the engines. The quantum drive wasn't humming anymore. It was roaring, a jagged human-centric snarl that bypassed the swarm's jamming frequencies by simply being too loud to ignore. "They're trying to find a pattern, Silas," Alara yelled, her fingers dancing over a cracked screen that flickered with the heat of the overcharged reactor. "But there isn't one. We've got 4 different engine types and 3 generations of salvaged scrap, all slave to one nervous system." The Vexor formation broke. For the first time in an eon, the hive mind hesitated. It couldn't calculate the trajectory of a ship held together by sheer stubbornness and welding wire. Why build a universal interface when a human-centric sledgehammer works on the first try? Silas punched the throttle. The spearhead didn't glide, it lunged. They tore through the center of the swarm, the ship groaning, as the stresses of the jump drive threatened to peel the hull like an orange. Beside him, Alara wasn't looking at the tactical map. She was watching the physical vibrations of the ship, her hand pressed firmly against the bulkhead, feeling the pulse of the machine they had birthed in the dirt of Terra Nova. "Now!" she barked. Silas triggered the release. Across the cobbled-together armada, hundreds of repurposed Xylari power cores, stripped of their limiters and re-sleeved in Terran steel, were jettisoned into the heart of the Vexor lattice. It wasn't a sophisticated strike. It was a localized collapse of space-time, a messy, brilliant improvisation that ignored the rules of engagement. The explosion wasn't a flash of light so much as a ripple in reality. The Vexor swarm, caught in a net of unpredictable variables they couldn't simulate, began to collide with themselves. Their rigid perfection became their tomb. As the last of the Vexor's signals winked out, a heavy, ringing silence settled over the spearhead's bridge. Silas let out a breath he felt like he'd been holding since the wastes. He looked over at Alara. Her face was smudged with soot, a small cut bleeding on her cheek where a stray bolt had snapped. But she was smiling. In the years that followed, the galaxy changed. The Xylari came back, not as masters, but as students, staring in awe at the shipyards of Terra Nova. They watched as humans took the discarded, the broken, and the perfect failures of a dozen worlds and turned them into something functional. Terra Nova became more than a colony. It became the heart of the galaxy's engineering, a place where the messy, the loud, and the adaptable reigned supreme. It turned out the universe didn't need a perfect machine. It just needed someone brave enough to fix it with a wrench.